Casey Nelson, and today I am going to be presenting on aviation biofuel opportunities in China. So, before we get a little bit into the reasons why biofuels are such a good option for China in terms of the aviation industry and what CO2 emissions are like for the aviation industry, I want to get a little bit of a background on the aviation market and to tell why some of the policy drivers are affecting the industry the way they are, and uh, why the China aviation industry is a little different than traditional other aviation industries, and how that affects potential policy decisions in terms of biofuels and also CO2 mitigation. So, China's aviation market has really experienced a massive increase in growth since opening in 1980, and specifically since 2000 when it joined the World Trade Organization. You can see from the graph over on the right um, that we've gone from about 3% of global jet output in 1990 to about 22% in 2017. And that's the consumption of all global jet output. So the major airlines in China are state controlled, and the three largest control 80% of the profits. And this has made private airlines, which are seen as a catalyst for biofuels development in aviation, as they can tap the new market for environmental conscious consumers, and also uh, cater to those customers better than the current state airlines can. And also, they are in recent years the main drivers for new aircraft in China, which are going to be a major source of CO2 emissions, and how policy needs to change around these new aircraft in order to get CO2 emissions down. We'll go through a little bit of that later. So China's aviation market in terms of passengers has been steadily ticking upwards at a significant rate. I mean, we're talking about an average of over 12% rate change every year so far for the past 2 decades. We're at about 550 million passengers in, in 2017. So to combat this really large change in the amount of passengers uh, in the past 2 decades, as well as upcoming growth, which we will see later, the Chinese government has really made it a priority to build new airports. And there's a huge infrastructure boom going on right now in terms of aviation. And you can see that over on the right, we have uh, kind of the layout of where all the new airports are being constructed. And in terms of biofuels, this is actually a really great development because you can see that on the eastern half of the country, this is where a lot of the new biofacilities are being constructed. Uh, you can see the blue and the red dots that are on the major of this eastern half of the country, where the biofuels industry is also mainly concentrated, as we've learned in class. So the Chinese government has been to build 100 new airports to reach a total of 20, of 244 by 2020, and this will give 82% of the population access to an airport. In order to do this, the government has been trying to open up more. There was a new law that went into effect just this year in January about more private investment going into state-owned and airports and airlines. But the fact is that the government still needs to own a major ownership share. But the real policy limitations are the fact that there are still restrictions in place besides just this ownership mandate. So some of these restrictions that are still kind of, well, these informal restrictions that are still in place are that, so banks are really reluctant to lend to private lenders, and that the minimum startup capital required by the Chinese Aviation Commission is about is still not enough to cover the 2 to 3 net year of loss that startup airlines typically um, suffer through, and that buying aircraft from overseas is very, very expensive and requires government approval. This is probably the biggest one that comes into policy, uh, affecting policy, is that these value-added taxes of 5 to 23%, and 23% being the higher end in terms of where the more advanced aircraft are coming from in terms of fuel efficiency, like the U.S. and Europe, and as well as the 17% value-added tax for aircraft parts from overseas, and the leasing of potentially more fuel-efficient aircraft at around an income tax and 7 to 10% really discourages the investment in the more efficient aircraft for the airlines, even though there's a significant increase in the amount of demand that's coming from the industry because of the increased passenger growth. So again, because the Chinese government wants this more of this $200 billion to be more privately controlled, um, they're trying to do that. But the thing is that in reality, and what's actually happening in the actual market does not reflect what the opening policies say for the Chinese government. So the Chinese government really needs to kind of tamp down on some of these other factors with to make private airlines have an easier time to get in, that might be able to take more advantage of their low cost structure and be more efficient with their fuel, and also so that we can get more fuel efficient aircraft. So the future aviation market in China is really where the concern comes in about um, where biofuels can play a really big picture and how they can mitigate CO2 emissions, which there will be a detailed analysis at the end here. And so they're currently, so the growth picture is over the next 20 years, is that we will have 1 billion, approximately 1 billion more passenger journeys traveling within, to, and from China. And this has caused, again, a severe surge in companies, uh, both private uh, and state owned. But the fact is that um, because these 4,000 new single aisle airplanes are needed to be constructed for low cost private carriers in order to enter the market, the regulatory structure needs to change. So China's aviation fuel market has, again, because of the extreme growth that is being experienced in the aviation sector, is expected to grow by about 13.6% annually. And because of this strong demand, uh, aviation fuel prices are expected to rise by about 10% annually on average. And this is on top of the fact that China aviation fuel prices are already artificially high. This is for several reasons, which we will get into later. But the fact is that the the fuel cost makes up a major portion for airline costs, and that this is an area where if biofuels are implemented with increasing costs, that private carriers can get involved with switching the dynamic and might have a strong entry point into the market and being able to outcompete the other airlines on in terms of taking advantage of carbon credits and decreased fuel cost. But the problem is that China, even if this was to happen, the problem is that China's aviation fuel market is monopolized by the China National Aviation Fuel Company, and it has a much larger preference to these state-owned carriers, and so the pay requirements are stricter to the private companies. So there's not as much leeway for the private companies to negotiate like agreements or to be flexible with their fuel supply or such in things like this. So in order to shift the dynamic of that, this regulation kind of this unformalized regulation kind of needs to change within that market. And the also thing is that so these The oil refining is primarily dominated by the state-run corporations. Again, it's like 70% six of the total downstream capacity is within these corporations, and that the only company that can import jet fuel into the country is China Aviation Oil, which is again owned at 51% share by China National Aviation Oil. And you can see by the graphs at the right that the annual growth rate has been around this 13% annually, and that fuel consumption year by year is continually going up. So, as I was saying earlier, aviation fuel costs tend to be much higher on average in China because of several factors. One is that there's such a high demand of oil, and that the other is that there's a limited supply of oil in the world, um, and that with demand for gas guzzling SUVs and efficient semi trucks and everything, refinement capacity is really going towards that end of the market. The other factor is that the government installs a price floor, so when prices are too low and uh, to keep to fight the the particular the pollution problem, which has happened recently. So this artificially inflates the price. But then what happens is that they install a price. They also install a price ceiling, so to keep the oil price from going too high. And what happens there is that the oil companies start to lose a lot of money. The state companies do, and then this has to be made up later. So what happens is that when during a time of relative uh, uh, peace in the market, when it's not too high or it's not too low, what the government will do is they will artificially raise prices to make up for losses during those high times of high-priced oil. So there have been some significant accomplishments in towards aviation biofuel in China. Again, like the rest of the world, this has mainly been on a individual airport, individual airline basis. But the thing is that the driver of this has really been outside of China and not within the domestic China industry. So, uh, and specifically, there the big selling point was that Sinopec, state-owned oil company, made a construction of this 30,000 ton capacity plant for aviation biofuel from cooking oil. And the particularly motivation from this was the fact is that the EU carbon tariff on civil aviation was going into effect. Okay, and so it's to help protect the Chinese airlines on that international market front. So the driver on this has not been domestically; it's been internationally and outside. So again, there are some hurdles to implementation that have been going on with biofuels, but they're kind of the same in every other country. And that there's insecure feedstock supply, the cost of processing is too high. There's really a lack of decreased risk investment, no real defined or available supply chain, in that really more feedstock needs to be available, especially non-arable land feedstocks and non-edible feedstocks, and more information and research information needs to be available on those feedstocks about what they contain in terms of what can be converted. So China historically, in terms of carbon emissions, uh, has been kind of a story of both real positivity and also some concern. So emission intensity has decreased significantly over this time period, which is great in terms of um, how much carbon is emitted per ton kilometer traveled. Okay, but the problem is that still carbon emissions have that rate is is significantly high, and it's still an increasing rate. But the average increasing rate on that is decreasing decreasing slightly. It's not as at its highest point as it was during the early transition periods in the 1970s. It's gone steadily down, and that's an attribute to the increasing fuel efficiency of aircraft that China has been able to acquire. So when we look at China's emissions in comparison of its aviation industry in comparison to itself and also of the globe, you can see that the percentage of this is very, very small. But as China's total CO2 emissions of the entire transportation sector have grown significantly over the years, you start to get a better picture of the sense that this 7, 8%, 9% um, steadiness over the past 2 decades or so is one of concern because the entire CO2 emissions are still on an increasing trend. They haven't flatlined or leveled out yet. And um, and that really that China's industry is still um, pretty nascent compared to CO2 emissions from, uh, for example, from the EU or even from the globe. They still make up a pretty small share, but it's going to increase a lot. So again, China hasn't really made some good accomplishments over the past few years about reducing uh, the amount of fuel that they use and the amount of CO2 emissions that are being released uh, per kilometer ton traveled. So their emissions intensity has been falling, and their fuel efficiency is falling. But in recent years, uh, there's really no way to to avoid the CO2 emissions increase over the next years of high growth, as well as the fuel consumption. What is more concerning, though, is that we have that emissions intensity and fuel intensity or fuel efficiency has started to stagnate. And the problem with this is that if you over this period of such high growth, uh, if those two metrics are kept steady and they do not continue to fall, what will happen is that CO2 emissions and and the amount of fuel consumption that's being consumed will go even higher. It would be best if these two metrics could could continue to fall. But that is not likely to happen in the in with the current political climate and current scenario. Um, and that we can also see is that these metrics have started to climb back up again, and that's a little concerning. So there have been some studies on the carbon savings by biofuel implementation to help deal with some of these uh, concerns about the stagnation of fuel intensity and how biofuels can help in this aspect. So Zhou et al. Did these very nice studies in scenarios uh, of uh, factoring in low growth, uh, baseline, high growth, and that the air traffic growth rate would um, increase at certain levels of a standard of 6%, which is generally what airline industries, um, the International Aviation Transportation Association, the United Nations, and the World Bank generally predict in terms of a standard traffic growth rate for China, factoring in um, a lot of other factors such as um, the world airline travel growth, and how that has correlated with China's growth rate and such. And there's high options and low options of 8 and 4%. And then also how incorporating biofuels, for example, uh, slowly, well, fast for um, a slowly added in timeline, what they kind of generally project right now by 2030, um, at a 10, reaching a 10% blend by there, and then having a high carbon fuel scenario where they predict that um, the that current refinery demand won't be able to meet um, for the current jet fuel market um, with just oil, because China is oil starved. So coming from this, so the results from these studies really show that if China continues on its current path with no changes of with that growth rate of 6% and that biofuel implementation of a 10% blend by 2030, um, which is in my view pretty unrealistic given the pace of change that we've currently seen um, historically, um, that the carbon emissions are going to reach 120 million tons by 2030. And even at this, the government is not going to reach their targeted levels of 60% decrease of carbon intensity of 2005 levels, which would have been 0.49. Um, they will instead land to overshoot at about 0.736. And even with uh, the um, the current growth rate and uh, the max biofuel implementation policy and the fuel improvement intensity, um, they will still overshoot and land at 0.59 kilograms per RTK. But what's the real story here is that I wanted to point out is that both of these both the blue line and the green line, okay, end up at the same place. But the blue line, okay, and the green line both have the same amount of fuel intensity um, usage. So basically the same amount of fuel efficiency improvement, okay, at a current pace uh, of 1.5%. But their source of fuel is different. So the blue line predicts a a standard fuel mix with basically no cold liquids technology, and the C line does, and well the green line does. And what this says is that the fuel intensity or the fuel efficiency factor is really a huge portion in this equation. So this gets us to the next portion about what the real driving factors are about CO2 emissions in China. And a sensitivity study was done on the previous study that we just got done viewing, and it was really that the traffic growth rate uh, is the largest um, contributor to the amount of carbon emissions that are going to go up, and that two is that the efficiency improvement of the aircraft is number two. Um, and then biofuel share, and then petrol fuel emission, and etc. So the more that China can do to mitigate its traffic growth rate and implement more efficient aircraft, the better it will be. And this was also proved in another study done by where they took 12 different airlines over the period of the last 15 years and surveyed them on different conditions and how different policies affected their bottom line. And what they came out with was that this potential energy intensity change factor, and also the scale efficiency change check factor, were the two uh, greatest causes of CO2 emission reduction, which essentially means is that the potential energy intensity change factor is the is the fuel efficiency of of the airline, and then the scale efficiency change is about as the airline gets bigger, okay, how it can spread, how it can easily more mitigate its emissions because of efficiencies at a larger scale. And so those two factors of traffic growth rate and also of efficiency improvement rate are reflected in that study as well. So what does this say about policy implementations? So the real need is for China to lift its tariffs on more advanced and fuel-efficient aircraft that can carry more passengers. Okay, the encourage of biofuels and aviation must be a priority, and it's not an option at this point if the government wants to meet its goals. And I mean, it, if it wants to meet its goals, but most likely it's going to have to revise its current goals, and then even if it revises its current goals, biofuels and aviation have to be a priority. The lessening of the restrictions and more support of private carriers to allow more penetration and to take advantage of a potential low carbon market. Um, and the making of a low carbon market is very important so that those low cost carriers can take advantage of a trading system like that. And then the government has to fund the backing of initial sites for feedstocks due to the large scale processing costs that are needed, but it needs to keep the state-run oil companies for the fact to reduce the cost of the upkeep of the distribution network of um, for the development of biofuels. But what it then needs to do is it then needs to um, enforce the fairness of the payment rules for our airlines so that they all have an equal access to that fuel, and that the distribution network um, isn't messed with in terms of that higher costs are for certain companies and lower costs are for certain companies, so that all companies have a level playing field in order to access the same amount of low carbon fuels. And then uh, a free skies policy above 30,000 feet, and a better coordination of military drills from civilian airports to make sure that that delays at airports are not held up, and that aircraft can always fly at their most efficient flying altitude, which this is not always done in China because the military often houses drills around airport areas, which closes off certain routes in the sky, and then an increase in training for pilots and control staff to help better manage the congestion and idle times at airports, and to make sure that the aircraft are always moving and not wasting as much time uh, on the ground as when they can be in the air flying.